The greatest discoveries in the galaxy were never made inside a laboratory. They were made around an ordinary dinner table. The observation chamber overlooking Earth remained perfectly silent as Lyra Velis signed her name across the luminous contract suspended above the crystal desk. Every member of the Royal Academy watched without blinking. Their silver robes shimmered beneath the pale light of the orbital station, while the blue sphere below turned slowly in the darkness, wrapped in drifting clouds and scattered city lights. For centuries, the Academy had studied emerging civilizations from a safe distance, collecting numbers, languages, genetic samples, and historical records. Humanity fascinated them, but only as an academic subject. To Lyra, that was no longer enough. At 25 cycles old, she had become the youngest royal scientist ever selected for the Cultural Immersion Initiative, a program considered so impractical that it had never advanced beyond simulations. This time would be different. She would spend 7 consecutive Earth days living exactly as a human. No royal privileges. No advanced assistance beyond basic translation. No hidden surveillance except emergency monitoring. She would sleep where humans slept, eat what they ate, work beside them, and obey their ordinary routines. The mission sounded almost insulting to many senior scholars. Why would the brightest scientist in the Empire waste an entire week pretending to belong to one of the youngest civilizations in known space? The answer, according to Lyra, was painfully simple. Data had reached its limit. Understanding had not. An elderly council member folded his hands behind his back and studied her with quiet disappointment. You believe emotions can be measured through participation. Lyra lifted her chin. I believe behavior cannot be fully understood through observation alone. Human beings are inconsistent. Precisely. They are irrational. That is why they deserve proper study. Soft murmurs drifted across the chamber. Another counselor activated the agreement. Brilliant symbols floated into the air like tiny stars. The conditions remain unchanged. If your conclusions support the Academy's long-standing evaluation, your research division will receive unrestricted funding and you will be promoted immediately. If your findings contradict established doctrine, your position within the Royal Academy will be permanently surrendered. The room became perfectly still. Every scientist present expected hesitation. Instead, Lyra placed her palm against the glowing seal. Accepted. The symbols dissolved into streams of golden light before disappearing entirely. Far below, Earth rotated peacefully, unaware that one of the galaxy's most accomplished researchers had just wagered her entire future on 7 ordinary days. Hours later, a compact shuttle slipped quietly through Earth's upper atmosphere. There was no dramatic arrival, no military escort, and no ceremonial welcome. The craft landed beside a modest energy maintenance station outside a small American town where late afternoon sunlight painted long shadows across weathered fences and quiet fields. Waiting near an aging pickup truck stood Ethan Brooks, 34 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, broad-shouldered, wearing faded denim, work boots dusted with gravel, and a calm expression that suggested he had repaired more broken machines than he had ever complained about. He glanced toward the descending shuttle, scratched the back of his neck, and smiled with the easy patience of someone expecting nothing extraordinary. Lyra stepped onto Earth for the first time. Her polished travel cloak reflected the warm sunlight before shifting into simple civilian clothing prepared for the mission. She examined the gravel beneath her shoes, the scent of fresh-cut grass carried by the breeze, the distant laughter of children somewhere beyond the trees, and the unmistakable aroma of coffee drifting from a nearby workshop. None of it appeared remarkable according to the Academy's records. Yet standing there, breathing the cool evening air instead of analyzing it through instruments, she felt something that had never appeared in any scientific report. Curiosity no longer belonged to her research. It belonged to her. The gravel crunched softly beneath Lyra's shoes as Ethan Brooks lifted her single travel case into the back of his weathered pickup truck with the same casual care he might have shown a neighbor arriving from another state instead of another star system. She watched him carefully, waiting for questions about her title, her technology, or the extraordinary circumstances of her visit. None came. He simply opened the passenger door with an easy smile. "Long trip?" he asked. Her translator rendered the words instantly, but the simplicity puzzled her more than any complex scientific discussion. Approximately 412 light years, she answered honestly. Ethan blinked once before laughing quietly. Well, that definitely beats my morning commute. He climbed behind the wheel, started the aging engine, and guided the truck onto a narrow country road lined with maple trees glowing beneath the warm light of late afternoon. According to every briefing Lyra had studied, humans displayed endless curiosity when encountering the unknown. Yet Ethan spent the next several miles talking about ordinary things instead. He mentioned that rain was expected tomorrow, that the town diner served the best apple pie within 50 miles, and that the old bridge was finally being repaired after months of delays. None of it seemed important, yet every sentence carried an unexpected sense of comfort. Lyra quietly activated the hidden recorder inside her bracelet. Observation 1. Humans often establish trust through mundane conversation rather than immediate investigation. Emotional stability appears to increase through familiar routines. The truck rolled into a quiet neighborhood where modest homes stood beneath broad trees casting long evening shadows across freshly cut lawns. Children chased one another down the sidewalk, while someone watered flowers beside a white fence. An elderly couple waved as Ethan drove past. He waved back without slowing. Everybody knows everybody here, he explained. Makes life easier. Lyra looked across the neighborhood with growing confusion. No surveillance drones floated overhead. No visible security patrols guarded the streets. Yet people left bicycles on front porches and greeted strangers without hesitation. The Academy had classified this level of openness as statistically inefficient. Standing before Ethan's small house, she noticed faded blue paint, a wooden porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze, and flower pots surrounding the front steps. Nothing matched the architectural precision of her home world. Everything felt imperfect. Everything also felt alive. Ethan unlocked the front door and stepped aside. Welcome home. Well, at least for a week. The final words lingered in her thoughts far longer than they should have. Home. The Academy had described this location as temporary housing for experimental observation. Ethan described it as home without even thinking. Inside, the scent of brewed coffee mixed with fresh bread and polished wood. Framed photographs rested on shelves beside well-worn books and an old acoustic guitar leaning quietly in the corner. Every object appeared to possess a history instead of merely serving a function. Lyra slowly turned in place, absorbing details that no database had ever considered significant. Ethan placed a handwritten note on the kitchen counter before opening the refrigerator. I made vegetable soup this morning. It reheats well. I figured after traveling all day you probably would not want to cook. She stared at him, uncertain how to respond. No agreement required him to prepare a meal. No regulation obligated him to consider her comfort. He had simply anticipated another person's needs. That possibility had never appeared in the Academy's predictive models. As the evening sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, Lyra realized she had already collected her most surprising piece of evidence. Humanity's greatest mystery might not be its technology or its history. It might be the quiet kindness that people offered when no one was measuring it. Morning arrived with soft golden light spilling through the kitchen window long before Lyra's internal biological clock expected wakefulness. Birds filled the quiet air with songs so varied that her translator briefly attempted to classify them as spoken language before abandoning the effort. She stood near the window, holding a warm ceramic mug exactly as Ethan had shown her. The night before, steam drifted upward in slow ribbons, carrying the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee through the small house. The Academy's nutritional files described coffee as a stimulant commonly consumed by humans. They never mentioned that people often paused simply to enjoy its warmth before taking the first sip. Ethan stepped into the kitchen wearing faded blue jeans and a gray work shirt, his hair still slightly untidy from sleep. He smiled without surprise when he noticed her already awake. Good morning. I hope you slept well. Lyra considered the question carefully. The mattress was considerably softer than the standard sleeping platform used by my civilization. Ethan laughed quietly. I will take that as a yes. She made another note inside her concealed recorder. Observation 2. Humans frequently answer technical questions with emotional interpretation rather than literal precision. The distinction appears intentional. Breakfast consisted of scrambled eggs, toasted bread, fresh fruit, and homemade strawberry jam prepared by one of Ethan's neighbors. Before eating, he quietly carried a small glass jar across the street and returned a few minutes later with an empty pie plate. "Mrs. Parker made me dessert yesterday," he explained after noticing Lyra watching him. "Around here we usually return the plate with something else instead of giving it back empty." Lyra looked from the clean plate to the jar of jam resting on the table. No currency had been exchanged. No contract had been signed. The transaction existed entirely upon mutual trust and unspoken gratitude. The concept resisted every economic model stored in her memory. Later that morning, Ethan drove her into town. Main Street stretched only a few blocks, lined with a bookstore, a bakery, a hardware store, a diner, and a small grocery market where nearly every customer greeted someone by name. Bells chimed softly as they entered the grocery store. A young cashier smiled warmly. "Morning, Ethan. How is your week going?" "Better now," he replied. "I have company." No one questioned Lyra's unfamiliar appearance. A little girl waved from another aisle while holding her mother's hand. An older gentleman tipped his baseball cap and wished them both a pleasant day. The simplicity of each interaction fascinated Lyra more than the advanced communication networks she had studied across dozens of star systems. Outside the market, Ethan stopped beside a weathered bench where an elderly man struggled to organize several heavy grocery bags. Without hesitation, Ethan set down his own purchases and helped carry the bags to the man's car. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. When they resumed walking, Lyra finally asked the question that had occupied her thoughts since arriving on Earth. "Were you acquainted with that individual?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really." "Did he request assistance?" "No." "Then why did you interrupt your own schedule?" Ethan looked genuinely puzzled, as though the answer required no explanation at all. "Because he looked like he could use an extra pair of hands." His words settled into the quiet afternoon like sunlight across still water. No speech about morality followed. No expectation of recognition appeared on his face. He simply continued carrying the grocery bags toward the truck while discussing whether tomorrow's rain might help the local farms. Lyra stood motionless for a brief moment, realizing that throughout the morning she had witnessed 3 separate acts of generosity, none of which had been recorded, rewarded, or even remembered by the people performing them. As she quietly activated her recorder once more, she no longer wondered why humanity behaved this way. She found herself asking a far more difficult question. What kind of civilization teaches kindness so naturally that its people forget they are doing something extraordinary? Clouds gathered over the valley just after noon, covering the bright summer sky with slow-moving shades of silver that reflected softly across the windows of Ethan's pickup truck. The air carried the unmistakable scent of approaching rain, and the breeze that drifted through the open window felt cooler than it had only an hour earlier. Ethan glanced toward the horizon before smiling to himself. "Looks like the weather forecast actually got it right this time." Lyra followed his gaze. Across countless worlds she had visited through observation programs, weather was controlled by orbital systems that adjusted temperature and rainfall with mathematical precision. Here, people simply looked at the sky, smiled, and accepted whatever arrived next. That realization fascinated her more than any technological achievement. They reached the small energy maintenance station where Ethan spent most weekdays repairing transformers, inspecting power lines, and keeping electricity flowing through nearby communities. The building itself was modest, its brick walls faded by decades of changing seasons. Inside, shelves held carefully organized tools polished through years of steady use rather than expensive automation. Ethan introduced Lyra to 2 co-workers who welcomed her with warm handshakes and easy smiles before returning to their tasks without asking uncomfortable questions. No one seemed impressed by status. Everyone seemed interested only in whether another person felt comfortable. Lyra quietly recorded another observation. Human workplaces appear to function through cooperation sustained by familiarity rather than strict hierarchy. Trust often precedes formal verification. While Ethan completed paperwork, she wandered through the workshop studying old machines that had been repaired repeatedly instead of replaced. Several carried handwritten notes attached with faded tape. One simply read, "Still running. Do not give up on her yet." Lyra touched the edge of the note with gentle curiosity. The machine possessed no consciousness, yet someone had spoken about it almost as though it were family. Ethan noticed her expression and chuckled softly. People around here fix things when they can. It costs less, and sometimes it just feels right. Even objects receive second chances? She asked. He shrugged. Sometimes people do too. Before she could ask what he meant, the station telephone rang. One of the supervisors answered, listened for a few moments, and looked toward Ethan. The community center lost power. Storm probably damaged one of the local distribution boxes. They have a senior luncheon starting in an hour. Ethan stood immediately. Let us go. The drive took only 15 minutes. Volunteers were already gathering outside the building, carrying folding tables, coolers, and boxes of supplies despite the growing drizzle. Nobody argued about responsibility. Nobody waited for instructions. Some prepared food under a covered pavilion, while others checked on elderly neighbors who had arrived early for the event. Ethan joined several volunteers inspecting the electrical cabinet. Lyra expected frustration over the unexpected interruption. Instead, she heard laughter echoing beneath umbrellas while someone offered homemade cookies to everyone standing in the ring. The repair itself proved surprisingly simple. A worn connector needed replacement, and within minutes lights flickered warmly throughout the building. Applause erupted from inside, followed by cheerful voices inviting the repair crew to stay for lunch. Ethan hesitated. We should probably get back. An elderly woman gently pressed a paper plate into his hands anyway. You can work after you eat, sweetheart. He accepted with grateful embarrassment before handing another plate to Lyra. She looked around the crowded hall where strangers shared tables without reserved seating. Children carried drinks to grandparents they had never met before, and every conversation blended into a comforting rhythm of ordinary life. There were no official ceremonies recognizing kindness. No public records documenting generosity. Yet everywhere she looked, invisible threads connected one person to another through countless small choices that no scientific instrument had ever measured. As warm laughter drifted through the room and rain tapped softly against the windows, Lyra found herself delaying another research note because, for the first time since arriving on Earth, she was no longer observing the moment from the outside. She was quietly becoming part of it. The rain finally ended sometime before sunset, leaving the town wrapped in the clean fragrance of wet earth and fresh pine carried gently across the quiet streets. Water still clung to the edges of porch roofs, falling one drop at a time with a slow rhythm that seemed almost musical. Ethan parked the pickup beside a small wooden bridge overlooking a narrow creek that reflected the fading orange sky like polished glass. I come here whenever I need to think, he said as they stepped onto the weathered boards. Lyra looked around in silence. There were no monuments celebrating military victories, no grand research facilities, no towering symbols of civilization. Only flowing water, rustling leaves, and the distant sound of frogs beginning their evening chorus. According to every comparative index used by the Royal Academy, locations like this held almost no measurable value. Yet Ethan stood quietly with both hands resting on the bridge railing as though the place itself carried meaning beyond calculation. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Lyra realized that humans appeared remarkably comfortable sharing silence without interpreting it as discomfort. She quietly stored another observation. Emotional connection may continue even in the complete absence of conversation. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence with a soft smile. My father used to bring me fishing here when I was little. We almost never caught anything worth taking home. Lyra turned toward him. Then why did you continue returning? Ethan watched the creek instead of answering immediately. Because catching fish was never really the point. She waited. Sometimes people just need to spend time together. The explanation seemed impossibly incomplete from a scientific perspective, yet strangely satisfying at the same time. As twilight settled across the valley, they walked back toward the truck and stopped at a small neighborhood grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. Inside, an elderly cashier recognized Ethan immediately. You are just in time, she said cheerfully. The bakery accidentally made extra bread again. Ethan laughed. Funny how that keeps happening. She handed him 2 warm loaves wrapped in brown paper. He paid for one and quietly asked that the second be delivered to a retired schoolteacher who lived alone on the edge of town. Lyra noticed that the cashier did not write anything down. She simply nodded with complete confidence that the request would be honored. Outside the store she finally voiced the question that had occupied her thoughts all afternoon. How does she know you will return the kindness? Ethan looked genuinely surprised. She does not. Then why trust you? He shrugged lightly. Because somebody trusted her once. The answer echoed inside Lyra's thoughts long after they reached the house. Later that evening, they prepared dinner together. Ethan patiently showed her how to slice vegetables, stir soup without rushing, and set the table even though only 2 people would be eating. Every action followed an unwritten rhythm built through repetition rather than instruction. The kitchen filled with the comforting scent of herbs, baked bread, and warm broth while soft jazz played from an old radio resting above the refrigerator. During the meal, Ethan asked about her favorite stars, the colors of distant nebulae, and whether sunsets existed on her home world. Not once did he ask about advanced technology or political influence. He seemed far more interested in what she had felt than in what she had accomplished. After dinner, Lyra sat alone on the porch while tiny fireflies drifted above the damp grass, like living constellations scattered across the night. She activated her recorder and hesitated longer than ever before. Her reports had always contained statistics, probabilities, and carefully verified conclusions. Tonight, however, one sentence appeared before every scientific observation she intended to dictate. Humans invest extraordinary effort into moments that produce no measurable advantage. And somehow, those moments appear to become the most valuable parts of their lives. For the first time since accepting the Academy's wager, Lyra quietly wondered whether the experiment was changing far more than her research. She wondered if it was beginning to change her. The 6th morning began beneath a sky so clear that every blade of grass seemed outlined in sunlight, still carrying the cool breath of the previous night's rain. A gentle breeze drifted through the open kitchen window, carrying the scent of pine, fresh soil, and coffee that Ethan had already poured before Lyra entered the room. She had begun recognizing the sounds of the house before opening her eyes each morning. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft whistle of the kettle, the wooden floor settling beneath familiar footsteps. None of those sounds existed inside the Royal Academy, where every surface remained perfectly silent and every movement had been engineered for efficiency. Here, imperfections created comfort. Ethan placed a warm mug beside her without asking whether she wanted one. She accepted it with a grateful smile that appeared almost instinctively. That realization surprised her more than the gesture itself. She no longer analyzed every human custom before responding. Some had quietly become natural. "I have one stop to make before work," Ethan said while collecting his truck keys. "Would you like to come with me?" She nodded, and a few minutes later they drove along a narrow country road lined with old oak trees whose branches formed a canopy of shifting green light overhead. The truck eventually slowed beside a small hillside cemetery overlooking the valley below. White stones rested in neat rows surrounded by flowering shrubs and carefully maintained grass. The place felt peaceful rather than sorrowful. Ethan carried a small bouquet of fresh wildflowers gathered from the edge of his property and walked toward a simple granite marker. Lyra followed several steps behind, choosing not to interrupt the silence. Ethan gently placed the flowers beneath the headstone and stood quietly with his hands folded before him. The morning breeze stirred the leaves above while distant birds continued singing without knowing they were accompanying someone's memories. After several minutes, Lyra stepped closer and read the inscription. Emily Brooks, beloved wife, beloved friend, forever missed. She looked toward Ethan, who continued watching the stone with calm eyes that held sadness without bitterness. "She passed away 5 years ago," he said softly. "A sudden illness. Some things even our doctors could not change." Lyra remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. She loved this view. "We used to sit right over there after work and watch the sunset whenever we could." He smiled gently. She always said the sky looked different every evening, even if nobody else noticed. Lyra studied his expression carefully. According to every model preserved within the Academy's psychological archives, grief gradually weakened emotional attachment over time as individuals adapted for survival. Yet Ethan still returned every week carrying fresh flowers, speaking of Emily in the present tense whenever he described her favorite places or memories. Finally, Lyra asked the question that had quietly formed within her thoughts since reading the inscription. "Why do you continue coming here when she can no longer hear your voice? Ethan looked toward the distant hills glowing beneath the morning sun. Maybe she cannot. Maybe she can. I honestly do not know. He took a slow breath before continuing. But love is not something I practiced because I expected an answer. Love changes the person who gives it just as much as the person who receives it. That does not stop when someone is gone. The words settled into Lyra's mind with astonishing weight. Every civilization she had ever studied viewed relationships as exchanges of measurable value, mutual advantage, or biological necessity. Ethan described love as something that continued existing even without reward, confirmation, or certainty. No equation within the Academy's archives could explain such behavior. As they walked back toward the truck, Lyra quietly activated her recorder for what should have been another routine research entry. She remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking. Observation 6. Humanity possesses emotional commitments that persist independently of logic, probability, or measurable outcome. Preliminary conclusion. This characteristic should no longer be classified as irrational. It may instead represent one of the most advanced forms of intelligence I have ever encountered. After ending the recording, she looked once more toward the quiet hillside where sunlight rested gently upon the flowers. For the first time since leaving her home world, she no longer felt as though she were studying humanity from the outside. She felt as though humanity had begun teaching her something no academy had ever known how to measure. The seventh sunrise arrived with a quiet certainty that felt different from every morning before it. Light filtered through the curtains in long golden bands while the familiar sounds of the house slowly awakened around them. The coffee maker hummed softly. A robin landed on the porch railing. Somewhere beyond the backyard, a lawn mower started its patient rhythm. 6 days earlier, every sound had been another research sample. Today they felt strangely familiar. Lyra stood beside the kitchen window, watching thin wisps of morning mist drift across the neighboring fields. Her wrist communicator vibrated once with a signal she had known would eventually arrive. A single line of text appeared across the translucent display. Royal retrieval vessel entering Earth's atmosphere. Departure scheduled at 1700 hours local time. She read the message twice before quietly disabling the display. Ethan noticed the subtle movement, but chose not to ask. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table with the same easy gesture he had repeated every morning. Big day, he asked. Lyra looked into the rising steam before answering. Yes, my mission officially concludes this afternoon. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we should make the most of the hours we have. There was no sadness in his voice, only gratitude for the time that remained. That simple response unsettled her more than any emotional farewell could have. After breakfast, they spent the morning repairing the loose boards on the old porch swing together. Ethan measured each plank carefully, while Lyra handed him tools she had learned to recognize without consulting her translator. The work required patience rather than advanced knowledge. When they finally finished, Ethan tested the swing with a satisfied smile. Not perfect, he said, brushing sawdust from his sleeves, but it will last a few more years. Lyra looked at the repaired wood. Back home, the entire structure would have been replaced within minutes by automated systems. Here people invested time because something mattered to them. The difference no longer seemed inefficient. It seemed deeply human. During lunch, neighbors stopped by with homemade peach cobbler simply because they had baked too much. A retired teacher waved from across the street. Children rode bicycles through the neighborhood, laughing as though every summer afternoon would last forever. No one knew an interstellar scientist would soon leave their town. No one behaved differently because they believed they were being observed. Kindness continued exactly as it always had. Late in the afternoon, Ethan drove toward the same open field where she had first arrived. The road stretched beneath a brilliant blue sky, bordered by tall grass that swayed like gentle waves in the warm breeze. Neither of them spoke very much. Words suddenly felt smaller than the silence they shared. They reached the field nearly an hour before the scheduled arrival. Ethan leaned against the truck, looking toward the distant horizon where sunlight shimmered above the hills. You know, he said quietly, when this week started, I kept wondering whether I needed to impress someone from another world. He smiled to himself. Turns out I just needed to be myself. Lyra lowered her eyes, feeling the unexpected weight of those words. High above them, a tiny silver point appeared against the afternoon sky, growing brighter with every passing second. The retrieval vessel had arrived precisely on schedule. Its graceful silhouette reflected sunlight as it descended without a sound, elegant and flawless against the simple beauty of the quiet valley below. For the first time in her distinguished career, Lyra realized she had prepared every scientific report except the one question that truly mattered. She knew exactly what she had learned about humanity. She no longer knew whether she wanted to leave it behind. The silver vessel settled above the meadow without disturbing a single blade of grass. Its surface reflected the afternoon sky so perfectly that it almost disappeared into the drifting clouds. A narrow column of pale light reached toward the ground, followed by 3 dignified figures wearing flowing ceremonial uniforms trimmed with strands of luminous metal. They approached in measured silence, their expressions calm, disciplined, and entirely professional. The eldest inclined his head toward Lyra. Royal Scientist Lyra Vallis. Your 7-day cultural immersion has officially concluded. Your transport is prepared. His voice carried neither warmth nor hostility. It was simply the voice of duty. Lyra looked beyond him toward the open hatch of the vessel. For years she had dreamed of walking through those doors after another successful expedition, carrying discoveries worthy of the Academy. Today the familiar path felt strangely unfamiliar. Ethan remained a respectful distance away beside the pickup truck. He did not interrupt. He did not ask her to stay. He simply waited with the same quiet patience that had defined every day they had spent together. The silence somehow made the decision even more difficult. The lead officer extended a slender data tablet. Please upload your final report before departure. Lyra accepted the device. Its blank display waited for her conclusions, expecting pages of scientific observations, behavioral analysis, and recommendations for future diplomatic policy. Instead, she stared at the empty screen for several long moments. She thought about the porch swing they had repaired together. She remembered the loaf of bread quietly shared with a neighbor, the community center filled with laughter after the lights returned, the peaceful hillside where fresh flowers rested beside Emily's name, and every ordinary conversation that had somehow changed the way she understood intelligence itself. None of those moments could be measured with precision. Yet together they outweighed every statistic she had collected across her career. The officer gently reminded her, "The Academy is awaiting your findings." Lyra finally began typing. She did not write equations. She did not list experimental results. She entered only a single paragraph. During 7 Earth days, I failed to prove that humanity is superior in technology, efficiency, or scientific achievement. Instead, I discovered that their greatest strength cannot be quantified. They consistently choose compassion when no reward is guaranteed, preserve memories that offer no practical advantage, and build communities through countless acts too small for history to record. These qualities have transformed the observer more profoundly than the subject being observed. She transmitted the report. A quiet tone confirmed its delivery. Several seconds passed before a reply arrived from orbit. The officer read the message once. His composed expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The Academy acknowledges receipt. You are ordered to return immediately for formal review. Lyra looked toward the waiting spacecraft, then toward Ethan standing beneath the broad blue sky with one hand resting lightly on the truck door. He did not smile. He did not plead. He simply gave her the freedom to choose. That freedom itself became the final lesson humanity had offered her. She stepped forward. For one brief moment, the officers assumed she was walking toward the vessel. Instead, she stopped beside Ethan. The afternoon breeze lifted a few strands of her silver hair as she faced the delegation once more. Please inform the Academy that I understand the consequences. The lead officer remained perfectly still. You are declining immediate return? Yes. Your position within the Royal Academy will be suspended pending review. I understand. Your future rank, privileges, and research authority may be permanently revoked. Lyra nodded with complete calm. Knowledge has always required sacrifice. I simply know now which discoveries are worth making. No one spoke for several heartbeats. Finally, the officer inclined his head with quiet respect before turning back toward the waiting vessel. As the shuttle lifted silently into the bright afternoon sky, Lyra watched it become a small silver star disappearing beyond the clouds. For the first time since leaving her home world, she did not feel as though she had been left behind. She felt as though she had finally arrived exactly where she was meant to be. 1 year passed with surprising quietness. The small town changed almost imperceptibly, just as it always had. Fresh paint appeared on a few front porches. New flowers bloomed beside familiar sidewalks. Children who had once waved shyly at the unusual newcomer now greeted Lyra by name as she walked to the bakery each Saturday morning, carrying an empty basket that never returned empty. She had learned to bake bread that was still slightly uneven, to wave at passing trucks without thinking, and to drink coffee on the porch before sunrise simply because the world seemed kinder when the day began slowly. The Royal Academy never erased her name from its records, but her title had been removed, her laboratory reassigned, and her research authority permanently revoked. By every official measure, she had sacrificed the greatest career any scientist from her civilization could hope to achieve. Yet not once during that year did she send a request to return. Ethan never asked whether she regretted her decision. He had long since realized that some answers revealed themselves through ordinary days instead of extraordinary conversations. Then, on a bright autumn afternoon, the impossible happened. A silver diplomatic vessel descended above the same open meadow where Lyra had once chosen to stay behind. This time it did not arrive with officers prepared to retrieve her. It arrived carrying scholars, teachers, physicians, and young researchers. The delegation stepped onto Earth with expressions not of authority, but of curiosity. Their leader, the same elder who had witnessed Lyra sign the original agreement, approached slowly and offered a respectful bow. "Your report was rejected at first," he admitted. "It remained the shortest scientific submission in Academy history." Lyra smiled gently. "I suspected it might." The elder looked toward the nearby neighborhood, where children laughed, while helping an elderly neighbor gather fallen leaves into neat piles. "Then our students began requesting permission to verify your conclusions. They argued that a proper experiment should always be repeatable." He paused, watching a young boy hand a rake to someone much older than himself without being asked. They returned with the same observations. More vessels appeared beyond the clouds. Not warships, not transports carrying soldiers. Simple exploration craft filled with people willing to live among humans, not to conquer them or judge them, but to understand them. The Academy had not merely accepted Lyra's findings. It had transformed them into an entirely new field of study. No longer would emerging civilizations be observed only through distant instruments. They would be understood by sharing meals, helping neighbors, listening to stories, and living ordinary lives. The greatest scientific reform in generations had begun because one researcher had refused to go home after only 7 days. As evening settled over the valley, Ethan and Lyra stood together on the repaired porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Across the quiet neighborhood, new arrivals from distant stars accepted homemade pies from smiling families, laughed awkwardly while learning children's games, and discovered that kindness required no translation. Ethan glanced toward Lyra with a quiet smile. "Looks like you changed more than your own future." She rested her hand lightly on the warm wooden arm of the swing and watched another silver shuttle disappear beyond the distant hills, not carrying someone away from Earth, but bringing someone else home to it. Above them, the first evening stars appeared one by one, and for the first time in the history of her civilization, those distant lights no longer represented places to rule or mysteries to solve. They represented neighbors still waiting to be understood. In the gentle glow of the porch light, surrounded by laughter drifting from nearby homes, Lyra finally understood the discovery that had cost her everything and given her even more in return. She had come to Earth to study humanity for 7 days. Instead, humanity had quietly rewritten the future of an entire civilization, one ordinary act of kindness at a time.